In the heart of the Ozark Mountains, in the autumn of 1924, there was a valley so shadowed, so cut off from the world around it, that the locals spoke its name in hushed tones, Widow's Hollow. It was a place of silence, where the songs of birds seemed to vanish into the thick canopy, and even the wind hushed its breath as it moved between the oaks and sycamores. Travelers rarely ventured there, and when they did, they moved quickly, with eyes lowered, as though the shadows themselves were watching. The year had been unkind to the Ozarks. Harsh winters had followed meager harvests, orchards bore more rot than fruit, and the rivers ran sluggish and brown. Small farming communities clung stubbornly to the land, bound not by prosperity, but by bloodlines and memory. And amid this heavy stillness stood a lone farmhouse at the rim of Widow's Hollow, its roof sagging, its walls weathered gray. No smoke rose from the chimney, no cattle roamed the pasture. It was a house abandoned by life, yet far from empty. Whispers told of the woman who had lived there, Sarah Whitfield, widowed young, left to wrest life from the soil with no husband, no children, and no neighbors who dared draw close after twilight. Some claimed she was a recluse, bitter and unkind. Others said she was a victim of cruel misfortune. But all agreed that her end had been unnatural. For one winter, when the snow lay high against the farmhouse walls, no one saw her again. By spring, the door hung open, and inside, the hearth was cold, a single iron kettle blackened to the touch. Her body was never buried, because it was never found. From then on, the valley earned its name, Widow's Hollow, a place of absence, of waiting, of things unfinished. Hunters swore their dogs barked at shadows they couldn't see, and farmhands claimed a woman's voice carried across the field on windless nights. Still, disbelief is easier to hold than fear, and the people told themselves it was just stories, passed around the fire for the sake of shivers. But in the autumn of 1924, when the leaves turned as red as embers and the nights grew long before their time, the hollow began to stir again. A young schoolteacher named Thomas Avery, new to the county, found himself drawn to the place. He had never known a mother's voice, never seen his father's face. He was a man searching for something nameless, something missing. And when he looked out across the hills, he swore he felt a pull, a quiet urging from the valley below. Each day, he passed it on his walk into town. Each evening, he lingered a little longer at its edge. And though the people warned him, sternly, gravely, Thomas laughed. "There are no spirits," he would say, "just the stories of lonely men." Yet his eyes betrayed him, following the tree line until dark. Curiosity, that great betrayer of caution, was already at work within him. It began with small things. A sound where none should be, a knocking, faint as rain, though no clouds marked the sky. A lantern in his window, flickering when the night beyond lay still. And then a voice, soft, fragile, almost a whisper, calling his name just as he was about to fall asleep. The first time, he thought it imagined. The second, a trick of fatigue. But the third, clear and unmistakable, left him sitting upright in bed, sweat running cold along his spine. The hollow was calling, and Thomas, though he feared what it meant, could no more resist than a moth can resist a flame. One evening, as darkness thickened over the hills, he walked the dirt road that wound down into Widow's Hollow. The air cooled as he stepped beneath the cover of trees, the sounds of the world fading behind him. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of leaves. Only his footsteps, echoing loud against the silence. The deeper he went, the more the path seemed to constrict, the trunks closing in, limbs clawing above like skeletal fingers. Yet he did not turn back. At last, the trees parted, and he stood before the farmhouse. Its frame was skeletal, its windows hollow, eyes gazing out over the valley floor. The porch sagged, its boards cracked and brittle, and the door hung crooked, as though waiting for him to step inside. Thomas hesitated. He could feel his pulse in his throat, in his fingertips. He told himself it was only wood and stone, empty and forgotten. But something in the way it loomed, still and silent, told him otherwise. Gathering what courage he could, he placed his hand against the doorframe. The wood was ice cold to the touch. He stepped inside. A stillness deeper than silence pressed in on him. Dust hung in the air, stirred by his movement. The hearth lay black, just as the stories told, the iron kettle still in place. A single chair stood in the corner, turned away from the empty fireplace, as though someone had risen once and never returned. He felt the weight of eyes upon him, though he was alone. And then came the voice. Thomas. It was no louder than a breath, but it swept through the room like wind through a shutter. His chest clenched. He spun nothing. Shadows lay thick in every corner, reaching, stretching. Again the voice. Thomas. This time closer. Just behind him. When he turned, he thought he saw the faintest shape, a woman's outline, pale and slight, dissolving as he blinked. His breath caught, his body froze, but then in the silence after, came a deeper sound, the creak of the floorboards above him. There was someone upstairs. And though every bone in his body begged him to flee, Thomas Avery climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath his weight, until he reached the door at the end of the narrow hall. His hand shook against the knob. His breath quickened. His heart pounded louder than the silence that pressed against the walls. He turned the knob. The door creaked. Beyond, darkness. And somewhere within it, the faint scuff of movement, waiting. The hollow had him now, and there would be no turning back. The door groaned as it opened, swelling the silence of the farmhouse into a tension so thick that Thomas Avery felt it pressing against his lungs. He stepped forward, his lantern lighting only the narrowest arc of the room beyond. The upstairs chamber was small, the walls cracked and yellowed with age, the ceiling sloped and sagging under the weight of decades. Dust clung to the floor in soft layers, disturbed only as he advanced. The air was colder here, sharp, cutting into his throat with every shallow draw. There was a bed frame against the far wall, stripped of any bedding, its iron posts rusted brown. Beside it, a nightstand barely holding together, its drawer gone, its wood scarred. On the wall above, faint etchings, lines scratched deep into the plaster, as though by fingernails dragged in desperation. He froze, lantern trembling in his hand. No sound, no breath, yet unmistakably, the sense of company. His heart throbbed in rhythm with the silence, each beat loud in his ears. Then slowly, as if willed into being by his own dread, a shape stirred in the corner. It was darker than the shadows around it, the outline of a woman sitting slumped, her thin shoulders rigid beneath the long outline of a faded dress. He blinked, and the shape flickered, as though it were not made of flesh, but memory. Yet even in that pale unreality, he knew this was her, Sarah Whitfield. Her head tilted slowly until her face surfaced from the gloom. The eyes, hollow, bruised with sorrow, met his, and though not a muscle in her face moved, he felt words touch the inside of his mind. A tremor inward, sharp as lightning. "Why are you here?" The sound was not of this world, nor quite of language. It was enough to make him stagger, clutching the doorframe for balance. His lips parted, but no answer came. He felt both repelled and compelled, caught between terror and pity. Here was a woman whose story he had only heard in whispers, now staring at him as though demanding something more than silence. But before he could speak, she was gone. The corner held nothing more than spiderwebs and dark upon dark. Thomas's lantern rattled in his trembling grip. He stepped further into the room, desperate for evidence, proof that he was not losing his mind, when he caught sight of something half buried beneath the floorboards near the iron bed. He knelt, brushing away dust. A fragment of fabric. The corner of a handkerchief, white once, now yellowed with time and stained across the middle with a rust-brown mark that needed no explanation. A woman's initials, delicately stitched in one corner, S.W. He stared at it, chilled to the marrow. Proof. Evidence she had been here, that her story had not ended in vanishing air. But what lingered with the handkerchief was heavier still, A question. What had happened here, in this room, on these boards? Something more than loss. Something deliberate. From behind him came the creak again, the unmistakable sound of a step not his own. He spun, lantern high. The hall was empty. Yet the farmhouse seemed to breathe around him, its walls groaning, as if the very structure were leaning into his fear. And then the whispers came. Not one voice, but many, layered, indistinguishable, rising from the very walls. He clamped the handkerchief in his pocket and fled down the stairs. The sound followed, folding around him, clinging, a chant without words. When he burst outside, the night was moonless, the valley drenched in black. He stood on the porch, chest heaving, sweat cold against his temples. The silence was weightless again, a stillness like a held breath. He dared not look back at the house, but even as he walked away, he sensed it watching. In the days that followed, Thomas told himself he would not go back. He threw himself into his work at the schoolhouse, keeping his lessons sharp, his voice firm, filling the long days with discipline. Yet when the nights fell, when the town settled under the screech of cicadas, his thoughts drifted again to the hollow. It gnawed at him. The vision upstairs, the handkerchief, the whispers. He found himself taking the long road after school dismissed just to glimpse the valley's rim. His dreams darkened, rich with fragments he could not explain. A woman standing at a window, her pale hand pressed to the glass, her mouth opening, but only silence spilling out, the feeling of drowning in still air. By the end of October, he gave in. Curiosity wrapped claws into his will, pulling him back to the edge of that crooked farmhouse. This time, though, he was not alone. At the general store, he had found company in Daniel Miller, a farmer's son near his own age, whose family owned land stretching the hills just north of Widow's Hollow. Daniel was no stranger to the stories. He had heard them since boyhood, like every child in the county, but unlike others, he did not recoil from them. He spoke with a tone of skepticism sharpened by years of hard work and harder truths. Folks see what they want to see out there, Daniel told him. A coyote's cry sounds like a voice, and empty houses have a way of turning creaks into footsteps. That's all. Thomas wanted to believe him, but he also wanted him there when he went back. And so one cold evening, the two men walked together under lantern light, their boots crunching on frost along the dirt road that sank into the hollow. Daniel spoke little as they traveled. His silence was not born of fear, more of wary respect. His father had hunted the hills beyond this valley, but even he, a man who feared neither man nor beast, had never set foot inside the Whitfield house. When they reached it, Daniel took one long, steady look at the sagging silhouette and muttered, "Looks like it'll fall over if the wind catches it right. If you're dead set on going in, best tread careful." Inside, the air was as thick and bitter as before, though Thomas noticed something new. Faint rings on the floorboards near the hearth. Circles marked by soot, as if jars or pots had long stood there, their outlines burned permanent into the wood. He crouched, tracing a finger along the circle's edge, but Daniel's voice cut him sharply. "Leave it. You don't know what you're picking at." But leaving was impossible now. Every creak of the house, every cold draft, every shadow that leaned longer than it should pulled Thomas deeper into its story. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, showing Daniel. "This was hers," he said. "Left upstairs." Daniel took it carefully, turning it in his rough hands, frowning. Then she was here. But if she was here, why wasn't she found? Folks don't disappear into walls, Thomas. Not unless something made sure of it. The thought chilled the air further. Whatever fate had claimed Sarah Whitfield had been neither chance nor accident. Someone or something had silenced her. And the house, the hollow itself, still bore the weight of it. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching against the walls. Both men fell silent, listening. From above, once again, the sound of a step. Daniel's knuckles whitened on the lantern's handle. "You heard that." Thomas nodded, his throat dry. Together, they turned toward the stairs. The staircase loomed again before them, narrow and worn, its banisters smooth from years of hands dragging upward in silence. Lantern light trembled on the steps, shadows stretching and collapsing with each breath. Neither man spoke at first. The weight of the sound they had both heard, a step that belonged to neither of them, was proof enough that hesitation was futile. If something stirred above, it was no wind. Someone or something was waiting. Thomas led, his boots careful on the groaning boards. Daniel followed close, his jaw set tight, eyes fixed beyond the flickering lantern that swung between them. The air thickened as they climbed, colder, bitterer, pressing into their lungs until it felt like breathing underwater. When they reached the landing, the silence hit sharp, so sharp that even the creak of a board underfoot rang out like a gunshot in the still chamber. The hall stretched narrow, its wallpaper peeling in curls, as if the house itself was shedding skin. Ahead, the door to that small room hung ajar, the one where Thomas had first seen her, the woman in the corner, the sorrow in her hollow eyes. Thomas paused. Daniel shifted closer, whispering through clenched teeth. "You're telling me you came up here alone?" "I did," Thomas said quietly. "And she was here. I swear it." "She, Sarah." Daniel's frown deepened, not with disbelief, but discomfort. The name was curse enough in these parts, one not spoken aloud in her own house. But Thomas had already stepped forward, a force stronger than fear, compelling him onward. He pushed the door wider, raising the lantern into the dark. The room yawned back at him, just as before. The bed frame bent low against the wall, the nightstand sagging, the scratches still carved into plaster like wounds. Only this time, something else had joined the scene, a second chair not made of wood, but formed from shadow itself. Its legs crooked unnatural, its back tall, yet it sat there solid as iron in the pale edge of lamp glow. Both men froze. The chair did not move, did not vanish. It simply existed, as if it had always been there, yet Thomas knew it had not. "Do you see it?" he whispered. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his chest rising and falling hard. "God help me, I do." For a long moment, the two men stood without motion, the groan of the house pressing in like a heartbeat. And then the air trembled. At once, the lantern dimmed, the light sputtering as though some invisible hand pinched its flame low. The shadowed chair seemed to pulse darker, the outline shifting, and there in its seat a figure began to gather. A shape, a dress draped limp, arms set too thin, and then a face pale as frost, eyes sunk deep, lips nothing but a line pressed tight. Her chin bowed to her chest, but her hair, graying and stringy, dangled like vines across her shoulders. Thomas's throat closed. The woman was not just an echo now. She was seated, carved into the room with the weight of a living. Daniel hissed, every word pulled harsh from his lungs. "That's no trick of light." The figure raised her head, slowly, painfully. Her eyes found Thomas, and with them came a silence darker than any sound. He felt his legs weaken, his chest locked tight. And when she spoke, the words struck not his ears, but the hollow of his bones. "They never let me rest." Daniel gripped Thomas's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Thomas shook his head once. He couldn't, not now. He had come too far, seen too much. "What happened?" he asked, the words fragile, the voice nearly torn from his throat. The woman's lips parted, the faintest whisper spilling out, a breath across years, brittle as autumn leaves. "Blood on the floor, in the earth, buried deep where no one dares dig." Her words shook the lantern flame. Daniel swore under his breath, his knuckles white. "Thomas, enough of this." But Thomas stepped closer, desperate now. Who did this to you?" Her eyes widened, fear in them, despair. She began to lift her thin, skeletal hand, pointing, not at Thomas, not at Daniel, but toward the floor beneath the bed. The rotten boards groaned, as though something stirred under them still. And then, in a blink, the chair was empty. The air crashed heavy, with silence, once more. The lantern flared back to life, bright and searing. But the impression of that pointed hand lingered in Thomas's mind, clear, insistent, undeniable. Something was hidden beneath those boards. Daniel grabbed his shoulder, firm, his voice low with warning. "Do not tell me you want to dig in this house, Thomas. You've already seen enough to damn any man's sleep." But Thomas could not release it. The handkerchief, the whispers, the woman, now seated before him, pointing. The pieces formed a shape, a direction. If something lay beneath that bed, buried beneath the farmhouse floor, then Sarah Whitfield's story was not just legend. It was crime. The two men left the hollow late that night, lantern light cutting a narrow scar against the trees as they ascended the road out of its dark basin. Neither spoke until they reached the open fields again. And even then, words came slow, strained. Daniel broke the silence first. If there's truth here, it's uglier than stories. And once you've pulled something ugly out of the ground, you can't put it back. Thomas nodded faintly, his pace unbroken. Then maybe it needs to stay out. Maybe that's why no one rests here. Daniel turned a harsh look his way, then softened. He saw it, the strange compulsion in Thomas's eyes, the way he seemed bound already to the widow's hollow, a fly caught in its silent web. With a heavy sigh, Daniel muttered, "If you dig, I'll dig with you. But before God, Thomas Avery, I pray you leave that place buried." Neither man slept soundly that night. And when the morning broke across the ridges of the Ozarks, its light too pale and its air too still, both knew their lives had tilted toward something they could not reverse. Whatever truth lay in that hollow house waited still, beneath the boards, under the floor, where shadows breathed through cracks and dust, waiting for hands to uncover it. The following evening came faster than Thomas expected, as if the sun itself had hastened to hide behind the Ozark ridges. His school lessons blurred. His voice rang hollow in the wooden-room classroom, each word spoken without memory of shape. By the time his students had gone, his thoughts were already back in the hollow, circling the shadowed farmhouse and the finger that had pointed at its floorboards. Daniel arrived at dusk, shoulders wrapped in a heavy coat, a spade slung across his back. He looked tired, but resolved. Thomas, lantern in hand, gave a short nod, and together they made their way down the dirt path once more, silence stretching between them. The hollow greeted them as it had before, hushed, forsaken, with the stillness of something listening. When the farmhouse came into view, Daniel set his jaw like stone. "We go in. We dig. We see. But after tonight, I wash my hands of this." Thomas did not answer. He could not promise what Daniel demanded. Already, that pale woman's face pressed itself before him, her sorrow heavy, warning and pleading at once. He was bound, no matter where this search led. Inside, the house groaned at their entrance, as though aware of their purpose. Dust stirred in the air, boards creaked underfoot. They shut the lantern flame low until the room glowed in a copper hush, then dragged the iron bed frame aside, exposing bare wood beneath it. Thomas knelt. His fingers traced the warped boards, feeling their uneven give. He looked to Daniel once, then pressed the edge of the spade into the cracks. The wood gave reluctantly, splintering, breaking away in chunks until the earth beneath revealed itself. Dry, packed hard, yet marked with old impressions, shovel cuts, long smoothed by time. Daniel released a harsh breath. So someone already put their labor here. The two worked in silence. The sound of the spade biting at earth echoed sharp, wrong in the still chamber. Sweat gathered at their brows despite the cold, the rhythm of digging heavy, relentless. The deeper they went, the more loosened soil darkened in hue, until the lantern's light caught against something else. Something pale, curved. Thomas's breath hitched. He bent low, brushing the soil with shaking hands. What surfaced was not stone. It was bone, white fragile, the smooth arc of a ribcage. For a moment, neither man spoke. The truth lay plain between them. Sarah Whitfield had not disappeared into the air. She had been buried here, beneath her own floor. Daniel's face hardened in the glow. God Almighty! They dug carefully now, reverently, brushing back the earth until more appeared. Slender limbs, the fragile curve of shoulders, and at last a skull tilted to one side, its empty sockets collapsed to shadow. Tufts of gray hair clung still, matted by soil. Thomas could not move. His chest throbbed with sorrow. He whispered the name as though it were prayer. Sarah. The bones lay pieceless, twisted as though the body had been pressed into the earth without care, cruelly, swiftly. This was no burial of love or mourning. This was disposal, silence, concealment. Daniel stepped back, wiping sweat and earth from his brow. Now you see. Whoever put her here, he meant she'd never be found. Thomas shook his head, voice low. But she wanted to be found. She showed us. Almost as if answering, the air in the room thickened. The lantern flame bent, wavered, grew long. The walls groaned louder now, and from the darkness overhead came faint whispers, weaving, building. Thomas clutched the lantern tight. He could feel her close, not in sorrow this time, but in unrest, in urgency. As though revealing her bones was not the end, but only the beginning. Daniel swore under his breath and spat to the floor, fear rising sharp in his eyes. We've disturbed her grave. That's enough. We cover this back and leave it. Tonight. But Thomas knew she would never let them go so simply. What had been buried in the earth was truth, and truth demanded more than silence. He gazed at the broken bones, his stomach turning. Someone killed her, Daniel. This wasn't age, it wasn't accident. This was done. Daniel's jaw flexed, his knuckles white on the spade. Then who? The question hung heavy. Outside, a wind stirred at last, the first sound beyond these walls and ours. It roared sudden, violent, shaking the windows, battering the house. The lantern flame whipped sideways, casting the shadows of the bones against the walls, tall and grotesque. And in the noise came a sound. Not wind, not storm. A man's laugh. Low, rough, carried through the wood as though soaked into the house years ago. Both men froze. The laugh echoed once, then faded, leaving only the screaming silence in its wake. Daniel gripped Thomas by the shoulder, his voice hard as stone. We're leaving. Right now. Thomas could hardly breathe, but he found himself unable to look away from the broken figure at their feet. A woman, wedged beneath the earth where no justice had ever reached her. He nodded numbly, and together they dragged the bed frame back over the spot, covering the hole with loose boards. When they left the farmhouse, the hollow seemed alive again, the trees leaning, the night pressing close. The wind raked their faces as they hurried up the hill, lantern swaying, boots stumbling. Only when the farmhouse blurred into the dark behind them did they slow. Daniel leaned heavy on his spade. You've seen enough now to leave it be. That woman was wronged, I don't doubt it. But what waits down there, in that hollow, is not for men like us to carry. Thomas's hands shook still, the feel of soil clinging to his nails and skin. But we already carry it. And if we don't tell, then whoever did it walks free, even in memory. Daniel stared at him for a long, strained moment, then shook his head. Then you start asking questions. It'll stir things you can't control. Families out here keep secrets like blood. And blood doesn't wash easy. But Thomas could not stop. He knew already he would go back, again and again, until Sarah's voice, her sorrow, found its end. And far below them, in Widow's Hollow, the silent farmhouse seemed to breathe, its walls swollen with restless memory. The past had been uncovered, and the past was not done speaking. The morning after their grim discovery, Thomas Avery walked into town with a weight in his chest that no sleep could ease. The children in his classroom whispered and giggled at their slates, but he barely heard them. His lesson bled into silence more than once. His gaze caught too often by the window and the road that wound toward Widow's Hollow. By the day's end, whispers of his distraction had already begun to circle among townsfolk, because in a place as close-knit as the Ozarks in 1924, eyes noticed, and mouths carried. That evening, when the last child had clattered out with books underarm, Thomas remained in the schoolhouse, staring at the chalk-covered blackboard. He felt torn by two instincts. One, to bury what he had seen and never speak of it again, for Daniel had been right about secrets running thick in these woods, and the other, to lay the truth bare, so Sarah Whitfield's story did not remain swallowed by the earth. At dusk, he walked to the general store, the town's nearest thing to a gathering hall. The smell of tobacco and cured meat hung heavy in the air, lanterns lighting thin halos across shelves of coffee tins, bolts of fabric, and glass jars of penny candy. Men leaned at the counter, farming hats low, speaking in measured tones. The name Whitfield was not spoken often, but the silence around it was thicker than any denial. Thomas stepped closer, his voice even, though inside him his chest beat hard. What do you all remember of Sarah Whitfield? At once, Every glance turned his way. The room did not fall silent, it collapsed. One of the older men, stone-faced with a beard bristled white, narrowed his eyes. Best not speak that name. She lived up by the hollow, didn't she? Thomas pressed. Lived and died however it was, another muttered, staring into his glass. It's finished. But Thomas felt the stirrings of the night before press at his throat. He could hear her whisper still, beneath the floor. It's not finished. Not if no one knows the truth. The oldest of them, Mr. Harlan, gave him a withering look, the kind that carried warning more than anger. Boy, if you value your place among us, you'll let that rest. Some soil's best left unturned. The conversation ended there, too quickly and too firmly to be ordinary. He left the store with eyes on his back, and in that moment he knew Daniel had been right. Families here kept secrets sewn tight, and they guarded them like wolves. That night, as the lantern burned low in his rented room above the schoolhouse, the whispers returned. Not only in dream, but in the quiet between breaths. Thomas down in the earth, not yet done. He sat upright, slick with sweat. It was her again, calling, binding him closer. No matter what the townsfolk said, the hollow's truth would not release him. The next day, Thomas found Daniel tending fences on his family's farm. Daniel's arms were heavy with labor, his shirt dark with sweat and dust, but when he saw Thomas coming, he muttered, I know that look. You've stirred yourself into trouble. They know something, Thomas said. They won't speak it, but they carry it like guilt. Sarah didn't vanish. They put her under her own floor, Daniel. And someone remembers how it happened. Daniel spat in the dirt, gripping the fence post hard. And maybe that someone's still alive. You think they'll smile and thank you for asking? Thomas's jaw set. I think silence is what killed her the first time. Daniel shook his head, the lines at his brow deepening. After a stiff pause, he said, Then if you're set on it, go ask the one person who might still know, without hiding behind town talk. Old Mrs. Carroway. She was Sarah's only neighbor, lived half a mile over the ridge. If anyone saw what happened, it was her. But Thomas, his stare hardened. Be careful what you make her remember. Old wounds bleed worse than fresh ones. That evening, Thomas set out along the ridge road. The hills glowed copper in the last spits of daylight, the air sharp, filled with the smell of drying leaves and wood smoke in the distance. Mrs. Carroway's cabin came into view as the shadows stretched across the grass, a place hunched low, its roof patched with tin, smoke curling thin and listless from its chimney. The old woman sat on her porch in a rocker, shawl wrapped close, her face a net of lines, her eyes deep-set and watchful, fixed on him long before he reached the steps. You're the schoolteacher, she said, a voice crisp but frayed with years. I've seen you pass this way. Not many do. Thomas removed his hat, bowing his head slightly. Ma'am, I wondered if I might ask you about Sarah Whitfield. The rocker slowed. Her glare sharpened. That name stirs ghosts. Then maybe they need stirring, Thomas answered softly. For a long silence, she studied him. Finally, with a sigh that shivered through her frame, she motioned to the other chair. Sit then. But I'll tell only once. He obeyed, the wooden step creaking under his boots as he lowered himself into the chair across from hers. The night deepened. Somewhere an owl called. Mrs. Carroway's voice came slow, burdened. Sarah didn't deserve what she got. Folks out here said she was strange because she kept to herself. But it wasn't strangeness, it was pride. She worked that farm alone after her husband died, wouldn't beg for help, kept her jaw stiff. Some men don't stand proud women, and out here a widow's easy prey. Thomas leaned forward. Prey to who? Her rocker stopped. Her eyes narrowed into the dark. A man named Elijah Boone. He had land down the valley. Mean drunk. He'd come calling, no good reason, but to lean on her fences and grin like he owned the ground she walked. Folks said she turned him away more than once. But men like him don't take no kindly. Elijah Boone. The name rang sharp, sour on Thomas's tongue. And what happened? Mrs. Carroway's lips thinned. One winter night, I heard shouting carry across the ridges. Thought it was coyotes at first, but no. It was a man's voice, drunk and hard, and then a cry that didn't sound like no animal. By the time I braved the hollow come spring, the door to her house was hanging wide, but she was gone. Folks whispered she'd left, run off in shame, but I saw the look on Boone's face when her name came round. I knew. Thomas's hands trembled against his knees. So he killed her. He's the one who buried her there. Mrs. Carraway's rocker creaked once, slow. Her eyes gleamed in the lantern light, spilling faint from her window. A man who poisons his soul like his liquor leaves marks on the earth. You found her bones, didn't you? The blood drained from Thomas's face. He said nothing, but his silence was enough. The old woman nodded once, grave as stone. Then you stirred it, and heaven help you now. Thomas left Mrs. Carraway's porch with the old woman's words burning inside him. The night seemed colder now, and every gust of wind in the trees whispered the same name. Boone. Elijah Boone. By the time he reached the schoolhouse, sleep was hopeless. He paced, restless, with lantern glow cutting sharp lines across the wooden floor. The image of Sarah Whitfield's bones, twisted beneath her own floorboards, pulled against the name that had been spoken aloud at last. Boone. A landowner, still alive perhaps, lingering in the hills with secrets unconfessed. The next day, Thomas pressed Daniel about the man. They stood by the split-rail fence of Daniel's pasture, the morning sun cutting pale streaks across frost-stiff grass. Elijah Boone, Thomas said, his voice heavy. Do you know him? Daniel gave a look that blended recognition with disgust. I know the name. Everyone does. He's old now, mean as ever. Keeps to a shack down along Dry Creek, what's left of his land. Used to own near 100 acres, but drink and fighting took it from him. So he's still alive. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Alive enough to scare children, but not the man he used to be. Folks say his sons left him, couldn't stand the lash of his tongue. He's mostly alone. His eyes fixed hard on Thomas. And you shouldn't go near him. Thomas clenched his jaw. If he killed her, he has to answer. Sarah can't rest until he does. Daniel's face darkened. Rest? You think Boone's going to confess, clean and easy? He'll deny. And if you push, you'll make an enemy you don't want. Thomas, men like Boone don't fall by the law out here. The law bends around them, same as a tree bends in a storm. But Thomas knew better. Or perhaps he only hoped. He was no stranger to injustice, but Sarah's voice, her whisper, her sorrow, felt like a hand upon his shoulder, steering him toward truth that could not be swallowed back. That evening, before the dusk had settled, he set out alone toward Dry Creek. The road narrowed as it followed the waterline, twisting beneath thick timber and jagged rocks. His boots struck stone and mud, his lantern light pulling thin against the shadows of evening. Somewhere ahead, dogs barked, a sharp, angry chorus that quieted as quickly as it came. Boone's shack revealed itself through the trees, crouched low, half collapsed, its porch sagging into the earth. Smoke dribbled from a crooked pipe chimney. Elijah Boone sat slumped in a chair outside, broad even in his age, shoulders bent by time, but eyes sharp under the brim of a wide hat. A bottle gleamed by his boot. When he spoke, his voice was gravel dragged along dirt. You're not from around here. Thomas tightened his grip on the lantern. Thomas Avery, the teacher. Boone grunted. Don't need no teacher here. So what's your want? The man's presence weighed on the air, an iron gravity that pressed hard against Thomas's chest. He'd expected bitterness, but he hadn't expected the raw menace that lived still in Boone's bearing, like an ember refusing to die. Thomas steadied his breath. I came to ask about Sarah Whitfield. At once, the old man's mouth twitched. Not in surprise. In disdain. He spat into the dirt and swigged from his bottle. That tale again. Thomas's voice sharpened. She didn't vanish. She died. Buried under her own floor. Who put her there? Boone leveled his eyes on him then, a stare that could have split wood. Young man, I've outlived men stronger than you poking into hollers they ain't welcome. Sarah was a prideful woman, too proud for her own good. Folks like that bring down their own ruin. The words coiled, crude, almost boastful. Thomas pressed forward, anger flaring despite his fear. You came to her farm. You stood at her door. People heard shouting that winter night. What happened between you?" The old man's lips peeled into a grin, tooth-gapped cruel. Silence stretched, and then he growled, "You best carry your questions back where you came from, or the hollow won't be the last thing haunting you." Thomas swallowed his rage, his pulse hammering. He knew the truth lay here, in the cracks of Boone's bitterness. But this was not the place he would wring it from him. Not yet. When he turned to go, Boone's laugh followed him, low, guttural. The same sound that had risen from the farmhouse walls the night they uncovered Sarah's bones. Back in town, Thomas told Daniel what he'd heard, though he softened the edges of Boone's words. Daniel looked grim, nodding slowly. "Then it's just as I feared. Boone won't speak the truth. And if he thinks you're stirring it, he'll lash out, one way or another." Thomas set his jaw with quiet resolve. If the law won't bring him to answer, then the hollow will. Sarah's voice isn't done. She won't rest until we see this through. Daniel drew a rough breath, torn between his friend's conviction and the weight of his own caution. "Then God help us both," he muttered. That night, Thomas dreamed again, this time clearer, sharper than before. He stood once more in Sarah's farmhouse, the lantern weak, the shadows deep. The floorboards rattled beneath his feet, lifting, buckling, until a hand broke through, skeletal and pale. It reached for him, not to pull him down, but to point, away, through the window, past the trees, straight toward Dry Creek. And when her voice came, it chilled deeper than marrow. He took and buried. But he was not alone. Thomas woke in a gasp, dawn's gray light crawling across his ceiling. His breath came ragged, but his purpose was carved into him now like stone. Boone was guilty, but not Boone alone. The hollow had only begun to speak. The dawn broke thin and colorless, its pale wash barely touching the Ozark ridges. Thomas sat at his desk in the schoolhouse, eyes bloodshot, his chalk resting idle against the board. The children noticed his quietness, whispering as the morning dragged on. He pushed through the lessons mechanically, but his mind remained trapped in the hollow of the night before, Sarah's skeletal hand breaking through warped boards and dream, pointing toward Dry Creek, whispering not alone. When the last student left, Thomas closed the door and leaned hard against it. Names haunted him. Boone, yes, but who else? An accomplice? A witness? Someone who had helped silence Sarah's voice and conceal her body beneath her own floor? He thought again of the townsfolk in the general store, their too quick hush at her name, their hard stares warning him away. Boone might have struck the blow, but more than one man had been complicit in burying her truth. That evening, he returned to Daniel's farm. The late light brushed long shadows across the fields. Daniel was splitting wood when Thomas arrived, his swing sharp, shoulders tense. "You look worse than the day before," Daniel said, sweat streaking his brow. "Bad dreams again?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, Boone had friends, didn't he? Men who sat with him, drank with him. Who were they? Daniel paused mid-swing, the axe lodged in the stump. His jaw worked tight before he answered. "Some names best left cold. I need them." Daniel exhaled roughly, pulling the axe free. "Boone used to run with two brothers, Harlan sons. You remember Harlan, the old man at the store. His boys were cut from the same cloth as Boone, mean as wet leather. Calvin and Roy. Always spoiling for a fight, always circling Sarah's place, folks said, before she vanished." Thomas's stomach clenched. He remembered the stone-faced Harlan who had silenced him at the store. "So the whole family guards the secret, or pretends it never happened," Daniel muttered, slamming the axe again. "But you stir it, they'll show teeth. And they ain't men who forgive." Thomas's gaze fell toward the ridge where the hollow lay hidden. She won't let it rest. Not now. Not with Boone laughing in his chair and Harlan's sons still walking free. He hesitated, then spoke lower. "I think she's guiding me. Each step, each name." Daniel froze, staring at him as though weighing whether Thomas had crossed from resolve into madness. Finally, he spoke, voice grim. "Then it's not just Boone you're chasing. It's the whole truth of the hollow. And truth like that gets men buried." The following day, Thomas lingered near the store again. Calvin Harlan arrived just as light faded, a broad-shouldered man with a scar crossing his cheek. He moved like someone who owned every board his boots touched. Behind him, Roy followed, leaner, eyes sharp and dark. They noticed Thomas at once. Calvin gave the faintest smirk, not of friendliness, but acknowledgement, like a wolf sighting prey. "You're the teacher," Calvin said, his tone casual but edged. "New blood around here." Thomas forced his breath steady. "That's right." Roy leaned close, his voice a drawl. "Heard you been asking about old stories. Ghost tales." "Sarah Whitfield," Thomas said evenly. A silence stretched. Both brothers shared a glance, too quick and sharp to miss. Calvin's smile hardened. "Best not tangle yourself in that. Folks tell such tales to scare children, not schoolmasters." Thomas's heart hammered, but he pressed on. "She didn't vanish. She was killed. And some of you know it." This time, the silence curdled into threat. Roy stepped closer, his voice low, venomous. "Careful, teacher. The ground in Widow's Hollow ain't the only thing that swallows men whole." The two brothers left without another word, but the message was clear. Back away, or be buried alongside Sarah. That night, the visions returned. Thomas lay across his bed, lantern extinguished, when the sound stirred softly through the room, a pattern tapping at first, like knuckles on wood. His breath caught. He turned toward it, and there by the foot of his bed stood Sarah's figure, formed of pale shimmer, sorrow soaking every angle of her face. She did not speak with lips, but her presence filled the room with words that weighed heavy as stone. "He struck me down." But the others watched. Her eyes lifted, hollow yet piercing, imploring, condemning. "Bring them into the light." Thomas bolted upright, and she was gone. But her command was carved into him deeper than flesh. The hollow would not be appeased by whispers or half-truths. If Calvin and Roy Harlan had stood alongside Boone, then their silence made them guilty, too. The following day, Thomas sought Daniel again. As they walked the pasture, he told him of what had happened in the night. Daniel dragged him to a stop, his grip iron on Thomas's arm. "This is madness, Thomas. You're chasing something that don't end with justice. It ends with blood. Boone may be a brute, but the Harlan boys? They're worse. They hunt in packs, and the town bows around them. You accuse them, you'll find yourself 6 feet under, before anyone says your name again." Thomas looked away, voice quiet. "So what? Leave her bones under the floor? Let Boone rot in drink and laughter? Let the Harlans live free, knowing they buried her in silence?" Daniel's expression stilled, worn by the sharp ache of loyalty against fear. He released Thomas's arm. "If you go down this path, you won't walk it alone. But hear me, past a point, there's no turning back." The autumn wind swept across the pasture, rattling the dry husks of corn. In the stillness between gusts, Thomas felt Sarah's presence again, an urging, silent, but unrelenting. The hollow was pulling them closer to its final reckoning, and no man could walk away unmarked. The air in town shifted after Thomas's encounter with the Harlan brothers. Men at the store stopped speaking when he entered. Women on porches pulled children inside when he walked past. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, quiet warnings spoken only with narrowed eyes. The message was clear: you are pressing where you shouldn't. Still, Sarah's presence never loosed its grip. At night, he heard her voice faint, threading through the cracks of his room. Not alone, not silent. Bring them into the light. Her sorrow was a chain fastening him to her cause. Daniel saw the change in him. "You're walking with ghosts, Thomas," he said one morning as they met by the ridge. Daniel's coat was buttoned tight against the chill, his eyes dark with worry. "They've marked you now, the whole town sees it." Thomas's reply was firm, though his voice carried weariness. "Then let them see. I won't lie in peace knowing Sarah Whitfield's bones lie beneath her own floor, with her killers unbothered while the rest of the world pretends it's just a story." Daniel said nothing, but his silence spoke plenty. It was only a few evenings later that Thomas's path crossed the Harlan brothers again, this time not in public, but on the road leading from the hollow's edge. The hour was late, the lantern swinging from his hand, when the crunch of boots on gravel pulled his head up. 2 figures emerged from the dark, their outlines unmistakable, Calvin and Roy. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmaster," Calvin drawled, his grin thin and hateful. walking the hollow after hours. Roy spat to the dirt. Or is he digging again? Thomas tightened his grip on the lantern, forcing steadiness into his words. I've already dug further than you'd like. Sarah Whitfield didn't disappear. Her bones still lie in that house. Calvin's jaw shifted, his grin faltering into a glower. You don't know what you're speaking of. I know enough, Thomas said. I know Boone wasn't alone. His voice dropped low, steady. Which of you helped him bury her? The silence that followed was colder than wind. Roy stepped closer, his face shadow in the lantern light. You want to watch your tongue? Thomas felt his breath sharpen, but he refused to lower his gaze. It wasn't just Boone. Sarah's voice names you. Both of you. Calvin's hand twitched toward his coat, but before violence could flare, the sound of another approached. Hooves on the road. Lantern light bobbed in the distance. The moment broke. The Harlan brothers exchanged glances, then backed away slow. But before leaving, Calvin leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey. You keep digging, teacher, and see what turns up next time. Graves don't all wait underground. And with that, the two vanished into the dark. When Thomas told Daniel what had happened, Daniel's face darkened, jaw tight. They'll come for you, Thomas. They won't leave threats hanging. You crossed their line. Thomas sat low on the porch of Daniel's farmhouse, his voice hoarse. Then the end is near, one way or another. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. You're too steady for your own good. He paused softer, but I'll stand with you. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. 3 nights later, after the moon rose sharp and cold, shouts split the quiet. Daniel rushed outside with Thomas behind him to find 3 figures mounted at the edge of the pasture. Lantern glow revealed their faces, Calvin, Roy, and Boone himself, older and leaning in the saddle, but eyes still sharp with menace. Boone's voice carried across the night, rough and deep. You stirred the dirt that was meant to stay down. That woman's fate is past, but you still got yours ahead. Thomas felt the cold blade of fear at his spine, but words rose in him anyway. You killed her. I've seen her bones. She won't let you rest until you answer. Roy laughed harsh and mean. Bones don't speak. Then you haven't been listening. Thomas shot back. The men stirred on their horses, their silhouettes like looming shadows against the ridge line. Boone's growl thickened. One more step, boy, and you'll find your own grave. Daniel's voice cut across sharp, steadier than Thomas expected. Enough. We saw what you hid. You laid a woman into the dirt like animal carrion. That crime don't dissolve with time. Boone leaned forward in his saddle, the bottle at his side sloshing. Careful. Truth like that don't win you nobility. It wins you enemies. And in these hills, enemies carry longer than bloodlines. The standoff hung there in the frozen air. Finally, with a snap of his reins, Boone wheeled his horse. The Harlan brothers followed, their silhouettes fading into black. But Thomas knew this was not retreat, it was delay. The air felt heavier than ever, filled with the promise of unfinished reckoning. That evening, back inside Daniel's farmhouse, both men sat without speaking for a long stretch. At last, Daniel turned toward Thomas. They won't let this quiet. You know that. Next time, they'll press until something breaks. Thomas's voice was steady, though exhaustion lay under it. Then it has to break open. All of it. Whatever Boone did, whatever the Harlans covered, it has to fall. For Sarah. For the Hollow. For all of us who live under their names. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound faint but sharp. Not laughter this time. Not dogs. A woman's voice on the air, whisper soft but clear. Closer. Both men stilled, hearing it, the hair on their arms rising. And in that moment, Daniel's doubt broke. He met Thomas's eyes, and instead of resistance, there was grim acceptance. Then tomorrow, he said, voice low, resolute, we drag this truth into the light. No matter the cost. The Hollow had spoken. The reckoning was near. By morning, a storm gathered over the Ozarks. Dark clouds bruised the sky, heavy with rain not yet fallen. The air itself felt swollen, thick with the kind of tension that makes animals uneasy and men speak in whispers. Thomas and Daniel set out before noon, not toward the schoolhouse, not toward town, but toward Widow's Hollow. The old farmhouse waited like a wound in the landscape, and both men knew this was the day when wounds would split. "We can't leave it quiet any longer," Thomas said as they walked. His voice carried not just conviction now, but exhaustion, the wear of a man dragged to the limit. Daniel gripped the handle of his spade, his jaw tight. "Then we'll bring it out, but only if we stand with both feet in truth. No fear, no bending." As the hollow came into view, they found they were not the only ones drawn there. Horses tied outside, voices simmering within. Boone's raspy growl carried through the broken walls, alongside the sharper tones of Calvin and Roy Harlan. The farmhouse was no longer silent. It pulsed with menace. Thomas slowed, but Daniel's hand met his shoulder. "We're here. We finish it." They stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under their boots, announcing them before they even crossed the doorframe. Inside, the three men turned, shadows thick about them, their figures lit by the dull light filtering through broken windows. Boone's eyes burned with a cruel fire, his bottle dangling loosely from one hand. Calvin stood rigid, fists curled, while Roy's lips curled into a sneer. "Well," Boone rasped, "the schoolteacher and his little ally come to preach truth again." Thomas held his ground. "Sarah Whitfield is beneath your floor. We dug her bones. We saw what you tried to bury." "You talk like a lawman," Roy said, stepping closer. "But out here, law don't carry unless we allow it." Calvin's gaze cut sharp. "You bring that story into town, you'll wish you'd never stepped here. That widow's been in the ground near 20 years. No jury, no court, no preacher's going to save her." Thomas raised his voice, shaking not with fear, but with the depth of what pressed through him. "She doesn't need a court. She doesn't need a jury. She needs her truth told, and she won't rest until every name is laid bare." A sudden gust swept through the house, rattling the warped walls, knocking dust from the beams. The lanterns the men had brought sputtered. Every voice stilled, and in the silence that followed came the sound, the soft scratching of nails across floorboards. The exact marks Thomas had first seen scarring the upstairs plaster, alive once more, groaning through the wood. Roy swore, stepping back with wide eyes. Calvin masked his fear with rage. "Tricks," he spat. "Just tricks." But Boone froze. His cruel grin faltered. For the first time, his hand trembled on the bottle. From the dark corner of the house rose her voice. Fragile at first, then swelling until it filled every space between them. "They struck me down, and they left me in silence. You watched. You buried." The shadows bent, swirling. And there she was, Sarah Whitfield, her figure forming in the lantern's tremor, pale, slight, eyes deep with sorrow. She stood not as a scream of vengeance, but as a weight of truth itself. Boone staggered back. "No," his voice cracked raw. "You were gone. You were gone." Her words lashed like wind. "You killed me, Boone. But you did not bury me alone." Roy shouted, "Enough of this trickery." He lunged toward Thomas, but Daniel blocked him, spade raised. The two exchanged blows, wood against fist, grunts sharp in the thick air. Thomas stepped forward, eyes locked on Boone. "Say it. Tell what you did." Boone shook, his face collapsing under fear and rage alike. The years of drunken armor cracked wide. "She mocked me," he snarled. "Mocked me before the whole valley, cast me out like a dog. I showed her a woman alone has no strength." Calvin barked, "Leave it, Boone." But Boone's confession spilled like sickness breaking. His words tore ragged from his chest. "I struck her once, twice. She fell, blood on the floor, red as fire. And when it was done, I stood shaking. And you," his eyes darted to the brothers, "you were there. You said it couldn't be left. You dug. You buried. You told me no word would leave the hollow." The silence that followed shuddered hot and cold. The truth was spoken. Calvin's face twisted with fury, not at the crime, but at confession itself. He lunged, striking Boone hard across the jaw. "You damned old fool." Roy broke from Daniel long enough to grab his brother's arm, but the room had already collapsed into violence. Boone stumbled, swinging his bottle wildly, Daniel grappling Roy. Calvin closing in with fists clenched. And through it all, Sarah's voice swelled. Not scream, not anger, but the lament of years buried in silence. Dust shook from the rafters. Boards cracked at their seams. Lanterns flared high and then burst, drowning the room in darkness, save for her pale glow. Thomas stood firm in it, her figure solid at last, her eyes locked on him with endless sorrow, endless need. The truth is spoken. Let it carry. The fight tore itself ragged, but neither Boone nor the Harlans left victorious. Boone slammed to the floor, bloodied, his breath shallow. Calvin and Royce stormed out into the storming night, spitting curses, vowing silence still. But silence no longer held weight. The truth lay bare, its rot spilled into the world. Thomas knelt near Boone, who gasped against the floorboards where Sarah Whitfield's bones still lay beneath. The old man's voice rasped, one final shred of fury clinging even as death's shadow pressed. She should have bowed. And with that, Elijah Boone shuddered, the last breath breaking loose from his chest. The house stilled, and Sarah's figure drifted lighter, her sorrow eased by confession etched into the air. Slowly, she lifted her hollow gaze toward Thomas, and for the first time, her lips curved. Not smile, not joy, but relief. Then she was gone. The hollow breathed deep, its silence complete once more. Thomas and Daniel stood alone in the dark house, Boone's body lying crooked on the floor. Rain began to strike the roof at last, washing mud and dust into the earth outside. The reckoning had come. But the reckoning was not yet closed. The storm broke heavy as Thomas and Daniel dragged Boone's lifeless body outside. Rain poured in sheets, carving furrows through the dirt of Widow's Hollow, washing away dust that had clung to the valley too long. Lightning cracked across the hills, lighting the farmhouse in jagged bursts of white. Boone lay in mud, his face slack, his cruel mouth finally eased a sound. The thunder swallowed him whole. His threats, his laughter, his drunken pride, all silenced. Daniel's voice carried hard over the storm. Leave him here. Thomas shook his head. No, we bury him. But not like Sarah. Not hidden. Together they worked through the storm until their hands blistered and their clothes hung heavy with rain. They dug not beneath the farmhouse floor, but out in the open where the land swelled at the hollow's edge. When they lowered Boone into the pit and covered him with soil, no prayer was spoken, no tears shed. Only the weight of earth returned to earth. When it was done, Daniel slumped onto a rock, mud streaked across his arms. Thomas stood, soaked to bone, his gaze fixed on the farmhouse. The hollow itself seemed to breathe lighter, as if Boone's confession and death had cracked some long-clenched silence. Is it over? Daniel asked. The question lingered unanswered through the storm. The next morning, the town awoke to whispers again, this time not the whispers of unseen phantoms, but of truth spoken at last. Word spread quick. The teacher had stood against Boone in the Hollow, and Boone had not walked out. The Harlan brothers claimed Thomas and Daniel had killed him in cold blood, swearing vengeance. But their words carried less weight now, for Boone alone could not bear the secret of Sarah Whitfield. And once his confession escaped into air, the whole valley felt it. Mrs. Carroway appeared at the schoolhouse 2 days after the storm, her eyes sharp with sorrow, but lined too with something like peace. I heard, she whispered. He confessed before the end? That it was him. Thomas nodded, and the Harlans helped bury her. He said it before them all. She exhaled, her hands trembling around the edge of her shawl. Then the earth can rest easier, and maybe, just maybe, so can she. Yet Thomas knew rest did not come simply. At night, when he lay in his bed, the silence of his room felt heavier still, as though Sarah Whitfield lingered close. She no longer showed herself in pale outline, no longer filled the dark with whispers, but her presence clung, as though she watched, waiting. One final duty lay upon them. At Daniel's urging, the two returned to the farmhouse. Together, they lifted the crooked bed frame, pulled boards aside once more, and removed Sarah's fragile bones from the earth. Carefully, reverently, with shawls borrowed from Mrs. Carroway, they gathered them. No longer hidden beneath dust and rot, the remains of Sarah Whitfield finally breathed air again. They carried her up the ridge road under a sky washed clean by the storm. In the churchyard just outside town, the preacher stood waiting, a man stern in face, but softened by the sorrow of the moment. A small handful of townsfolk gathered too, their whispers subdued, their faces drawn with uncertainty. The Harlans did not come. The preacher spoke words for Sarah Whitfield that the valley had denied her for near 20 years. Words of peace, words of release. When earth finally closed over her bones, Thomas felt his throat tighten, not in fear now, but in something like relief and grief tangled together. For the first time, Sarah was no longer abandoned. She was named. She was seen. That night, Thomas walked alone down the dirt road to Widow's Hollow. The farmhouse rose in the dark, bent and broken, its windows hollow sockets staring out into the quiet valley. He stepped onto the porch, lantern low, the rain-slick air carrying a stillness that felt less heavy now. Inside, silence remained, but it was not the silence of horror, not the suffocating hush of wrong buried deep. It was the calm after storm, the kind that waits in the corners of an empty house. He stood long in that room where her body had once been hidden beneath the floor, the boards now unsettled and bare. He half expected her voice again, her sorrow rising. But there was nothing, only quiet, only peace. Thomas placed his lantern on the hearth and lowered himself onto the crooked chair, still waiting by the wall. For the first time since he had seen her pale figure in the corner, he felt she was gone, not banished, not erased, but finally loosed from the weight of the earth. He whispered her name softly, as if to send it with her. Sarah Whitfield. The house said nothing back, and that, Thomas thought, was answer enough. As winter set across the Ozarks, life in town bent back toward steady rhythm. Children filled Thomas's schoolhouse with chatter, and Daniel put his energy back into the grind of farm work. Yet the hollow never loosened its mark upon them. It lingered in memory, a scar carved into the ridges. Calvin and Roy Harlan grew quieter in their dealings, no longer strutting so boldly. Their threats dulled in the face of what the hollow had forced into light. They carried the stain of it, unavoidable, and the valley carried the knowledge, too. Secrets, once buried, no longer rolled clean in shadows. And sometimes, on the windless nights, Thomas thought he could still hear faint whispers carried across Widow's Hollow. Not cries, not sorrow, only the memory of a woman who had been wronged, now at last accounted for. A reminder that silence cannot bind truth forever, no matter how deep the grave, no matter how thick the earth above it. For Sarah Whitfield's story had been spoken, and in that her haunting ended. The hollow remained veiled and still, but its name carried new weight, not as a place of unfinished death, but as a warning branded into the hills of the Ozarks. The earth remembers, and the earth does not stay quiet.
Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.